Okay, let's unpack this. If you think about life as a constant negotiation, the key challenge is really adaptation. How do you keep that internal environment, that steady state we call homeostasis, perfectly balanced when everything around you is constantly changing? Our sources make it pretty clear. The main way we manage these necessary, often really rapid changes in how our cells work is through hormones. They're the supreme commanders of our biological communication.
And that system of communication is just so critical, not just for moment-to-moment survival, but for our long-term health. What's truly fascinating is the physics of it. A single hormone binding to its receptor doesn't just send one little signal, no. It generates this massive amplified cascade inside the cell. That cascade then regulates, well, everything from basic enzyme activity all the way to the fundamental wiring of the cell, turning genes on and off.
Which connects directly to medicine.
Exactly. This is why these pathways are so medically important. Any error, too much, too little, or just the wrong signal at the wrong time is a major root cause of disease. And that makes these pathways incredibly rich targets for, well, almost every drug on the market.
So our mission today is a deep dive into the molecular blueprint of hormone action. We'll categorize them by how the signals are recognized and transduced, just following the structure laid out in our source material. It's a journey from the cell surface straight down to the DNA. Let's start with the sequence of events. It's this beautifully coordinated response. You have a stimulus, a challenge of some kind. That stimulus is recognized maybe by the nervous system, maybe by sensing a chemical factor like blood pH. That recognition triggers the hormone release, which generates the signal, and that leads to the final coordinated response.
Right, and that response ultimately boils down to two things. Changing the amount of a protein you have, usually by transcribing a gene, or changing the activity of the proteins you already have through modification or just moving them around the cell.
And this is where we see the first big split, right? The two major families of hormones.
Immediately. You have group I hormones, which are the fat-soluble or lipophilic ones. So think steroids like cortisol and thyroid hormones. Because they're lipid-soluble, they have no problem just slipping right through the plasma membrane.
So their receptors are inside.
Exactly. Their receptors are intracellular. They're waiting in the cytoplasm or the nucleus. They're the ultimate molecular light switches directly controlling which genes get expressed.
And then you have group 2?
Group 2, yeah. These are the massive water-soluble peptides and catecholamines. They're hydrophilic, so they can't just walk through that lipid front door. They tend to have shorter half-lives and need to use recognition sites on the outside of the plasma membrane.
So they need a messenger boy.
They need a second messenger to relay the command inside.
Okay, let's stick with group I for a minute. The strategy is all about getting to the DNA. How does something like a glucocorticoid do it?
So a glucocorticoid, for instance, diffuses across the membrane and finds its receptor, which is just sort of chilling in the cytoplasm, usually shackled to a chaperone protein called HSP90.
Okay.
And the crucial part is this. The hormone binding forces the receptor to completely change its shape. That conformational change causes the HSP90 chaperone to just fall off.
So binding the hormone releases the brakes, and that allows the activated complex to head for the nucleus.
Precisely. Once it's inside, that activated complex seeks out a very specific stretch of DNA called the glucocorticoid response element, or GRE. When the liganded receptor binds there, it recruits coactivator proteins, and transcription of that target gene just ramps up.
Okay, so that's a cytoplasm to nucleus shuttle, where the chaperone falling off is key.
Yeah.
But thyroid hormones and retinoids do it differently.
They do. They have an even more direct path. They go straight into the nucleus. And here's the difference. Their receptor, which is often paired up with a partner receptor called RXR, it's already sitting on the DNA response element. In the absence of the hormone, that DNA-bound receptor is complexed with a core pressor. It's basically acting as a tonic brake, constantly repressing transcription.
So the hormone's job is to remove the brake.
Exactly. When the hormone shows up, the ligand binding induces a conformational change that causes the core pressor to release.
So in the glucocorticoid path, the hormone lets the receptor bind to DNA. In the thyroid path, the hormone makes a bound receptor stop repressing. The end result is the same powerful effect, a change in gene transcription. This explains why steroid effects can take hours, even days to show up. You're waiting for new proteins to be made. Now we transition to group 2. These are the water-soluble hormones knocking on the cell's front door. Since they can't get in, they need those second messengers.
Right. Small, non-protein molecules like CAMP, calcium, or cGMP to relay and amplify the signal inside.
And the most common way they do this is through what? G-protein coupled receptors?
G-protein coupled receptors, or GPCRs. These are these massive 7-helix structures that just snake back and forth across the plasma membrane, and they connect to the effectors inside the cell via an intermediary called the G protein.
Which is a complex of 3 subunits, right? Alpha, beta, and gamma.
That's the one. And let's walk through its life cycle, because it's like a complex molecular timer.
Okay.
In the inactive state, the alpha subunit has GDP bound to it. When the hormone binds the GPCR, the receptor changes shape and grabs the G protein. This forces the alpha subunit to kick out the GDP and swap it for a high-energy GTP.
And that's the on switch.
That's the on switch. The alpha-GTP complex is now active, and it breaks away from the beta-gamma subunits.
So that alpha GTP subunit is the active dispatcher. It goes off and activates an effector enzyme, like adenylyl. But if the signal is always being generated, how does the system ever reset?
That's where the timer comes in. The alpha subunit has an intrinsic GTPase activity. Think of it as a built-in self-destruct function. It slowly hydrolyzes the active GTP back to the inactive GDP. That timer stops the signal, the alpha subunit reassociates with the beta-gamma pair, and the whole system resets, ready for the next hormone.
That GTPase activity sounds like a crucial regulatory choke point, and if that system breaks...
The signal runs wild, and it's a spectacular clinical example. Cholera toxin, for instance, directly modifies the stimulating G protein alpha subunit, the alphas. It effectively jams that self-destruct switch, stopping the GTPase activity.
So the alphas is just perpetually active.
Perpetually active. It leads to massive unopposed signaling and the severe symptoms of the disease. And pertussis toxin does something similar to the inhibitory G protein, making sure that even inhibitory signals can't shut the system down.
Speaking of signaling, let's focus on the second messenger ever identified. Cyclic AMP or CAN-AMP. It's made from ATP by an enzyme called adenylyl.
And adenylyl, or AC, is a fascinating hub because it's under dual control. Hormones like glucagon or adrenaline can activate the stimulatory G protein, Gs, which turns AC on. But conversely, hormones like acetylcholine can activate the inhibitory G protein, G, which turns AC off. This lets the cell constantly fine-tune its internal CMP levels based on competing demands from the outside.
So once CAMP levels spike, how does that rise get translated into a large-scale cellular response?
CMP's main target is an enzyme called Protein Kinase A, or PKA. PKA usually exists as an inactive complex where 2 regulatory subunits are clamped onto and inhibiting 2 catalytic subunits.
So it's locked down.
It's locked down, but when 4 CAMP molecules bind to those regulatory subunits, it forces them to dissociate.
And the moment those active catalytic subunits are released, they're free to go to work.
Exactly. They just start phosphorylating target proteins, adding phosphate groups, usually onto serine or 309 residues. And this phosphorylation is a switch that changes the protein's activity, turning an enzyme on or off.
But what stops this powerful kinase from just phosphorylating everything in sight?
Specificity. A lot of that is controlled by things called HCAPS-A kinase anchoring proteins. They act like scaffolds, keeping PKA physically localized right next to the specific proteins it's supposed to modify.
That physical localization is critical for avoiding cellular chaos. And of course, the signal has to be shut down quickly, too.
It does. It's terminated in 2 main ways. First, AMP itself is destroyed hydrolyzed back to 5' AMP by enzymes called phosphatidylinositol, or PDEs.
And that's clinically important.
Very. If you inhibit PDEs, you keep the CAMP signal running longer. That's why common things like caffeine, which is a PDE inhibitor, act as stimulants.
And the second way?
The phosphorylation events themselves are rapidly reversed by phosphatases, which just strip the phosphate groups off, resetting the affected proteins.
And KMP isn't just about fast enzymatic changes. It reaches all the way to the nucleus, too.
It does. When PKA is active, it can travel into the nucleus and phosphorylate a transcription factor called CEB. Phosphorylated then binds to its specific DNA sequence, recruits other coactivators, and powerfully activates the transcription of target genes. That's how you get those longer-term changes.
Moving on, we have cGMP, which is made by guanylyl cyclase. Where does this second messenger usually play a role?
cGMP is often the signal for relaxation and dilation. Membrane-bound guanylyl cyclase is activated by peptides like atriuretic factor, which triggers vasodilation. More famously, though, the soluble form is activated by nitric oxide.
Ah, the signal for smooth muscle relaxation in blood vessels.
Exactly. The resulting cGMP activates PKG, the cGMP-dependent protein kinase.
And this is exactly where a drug like sildenafil comes in, right?
It's a perfect illustration. Sildenafil is an inhibitor of the specific phosphatidylinosyl that degrades cGMP. By slowing down its degradation, you prolong the relaxation signal triggered by nitric oxide. That's its mechanism of action.
Now, calcium. As a messenger, it's incredibly powerful because the cell works so hard to keep its free concentration inside the cytoplasm at, well, vanishingly low levels.
Right. Maintaining that incredibly steep concentration gradient is a huge energy investment, constantly running pumps and exchangers. Hormones can rapidly increase cytosolic calcium in 3 ways: by opening ligand-gated channels, by opening voltage-gated channels, or, crucially, by mobilizing stored calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER.
And once that sudden spike happens, the cell detects it using calmodulin.
Calmodulin is the key sensor. It's a small protein with 4 binding sites for calcium. When calcium binds to all 4 sites, it forces this radical conformational change in calmodulin. This activated complex then turns on various enzymes and ion channels, especially the calcium-dependent protein kinases.
You talked about G's and G, but there's a third major G protein family, GQ, which uses calcium and a whole different second messenger system.
The phosphatidylinositol system. Yes, this is a beautiful example of simultaneous signaling. Hormones like alpha-1 catecholamines activate an enzyme called phospholipase C, or PLC, via the GQ protein.
Okay.
PLC then targets a membrane lipid called PIP2 and hydrolyzes it, splitting it into 2 potent second messengers at the same time.
And what are those 2 commands?
The first is IP3, inositol trisphosphate, which is water-soluble. It floats into the cytoplasm, binds to receptors on the ER, and triggers this massive release of stored calcium.
And the second?
The second is DAVRI, or 142-diacylglycerol, which stays right there in the membrane where it activates another enzyme, Protein Kinase C, or PKC.
So the net effect is this powerful synergy. You get the calcium spike, which activates the calmodulin kinases, and at the same time you get activation of PKC, which also needs calcium for its full activity. It leads to widespread protein phosphorylation and the final physiological change. We've covered second messengers, but we still need to talk about receptors that are crucial for things like growth and differentiation, the ones for insulin and epidermal growth factor. These rely on tyrosine kinase activity.
Right, and these systems are structurally different from GPCRs. The receptor for insulin, for example, has intrinsic tyrosine kinase activity embedded right in its cytoplasmic domain. When insulin binds, the receptors dimerize, they come together in pairs, and they immediately phosphorylate themselves on multiple tyrosine residues. This is called autophosphorylation.
And those phosphorylated tyrosine residues are the absolute key. They become molecular docking stations.
Exactly. The PY residues on the receptor become these high-affinity docking sites for various adapter proteins that contain what are called SH2 domains. This is how the receptor starts a cascade.
So for insulin, the phosphorylated receptor actually phosphorylates other things first.
Yes, it phosphorylates the insulin receptor substrates, or IRS proteins, and the PY residues on IRS then serve as the major docking station for 2 crucial downstream pathways.
Let's quickly trace those. What's the metabolic command?
That's the PI3 kinase pathway. PI3 kinase binds to IRS, it gets activated, and it generates these unique second messenger lipids that activate kinases like PKB or AKT. This pathway is critical for rapidly regulating protein translocation like moving glucose transporters to the cell surface and activating metabolic enzymes.
And that's regulated by the phosphatase PTN, which antagonizes the signal.
Exactly, it keeps it in check.
And the second pathway,
Yeah.
the one more associated with proliferation.
That's the mitogenic pathway. Here, a different set of adapter proteins binds to IRS, and that eventually leads to the activation of the small GTPase, P21-RAs.
RAS.
Which in turn initiates the MAP kinase cascade, a series of kinases including RAF1 and MEK that ultimately moves to the nucleus to regulate cell division and growth.
We also have hormones like growth hormone and prolactin, which don't have their own kinase activity but still rely on tyrosine phosphorylation. This is the JAK-STAT pathway.
It basically works by borrowing the machinery. The ligand binds, the receptors dimerize, but instead of having its own kinase domain, it activates these associated cytoplasmic tyrosine kinases, the JAKs.
Okay.
JAKs then phosphorylate the receptor, creating more docking sites. These sites recruit stat signal transducers and activators of transcription. Once the stats are phosphorylated by the JAKs, they dimerize, move into the nucleus, and regulate transcription directly.
So it all converges back to the nucleus. Ultimately, the most lasting physiological results come from altering the transcription rate of specific genes, which is handled by the nuclear receptor superfamily.
And this superfamily has over 50 members. They all share this remarkably conserved structure, a central DNA binding domain with 2 zinc finger motifs, and a multifunctional ligand binding domain. The specificity of where they bind is really finely tuned. Classic receptors bind to inverted repeats as homodimers, but others, like the thyroid hormone receptor, bind as heterodimers with the RXR partner to direct repeats. The precise spacing between the sites determines which receptor can grab hold and turn a gene on or off.
And once the receptor is bound to the DNA, it needs help. It recruits an army of coregulators.
These coregulators are essential. They're molecular bridges and tools that physically remodel the DNA structure. Key coactivators, like the CBP300 family, they interact with many different transcription factors. SREB, STATs, nuclear receptors. They have intrinsic histone acetyltransferase, or H8T activity.
So conceptually, why does H8 activity matter?
Because DNA is so tightly coiled around histone proteins, H8 activity chemically neutralizes the histones, causing the coils to relax. It's like loosening the DNA spool so the transcription machinery can finally get in there and access the gene.
And on the flip side, you have the core pressors.
Those are the tonic brakes, like NCR and SMRT, which actively repress transcription. As we saw with the thyroid hormone receptor, the ligand binding causes the core pressor to dissociate, activating the gene by, well, removing the brakes.
We have to end on what might be the most impressive example of hormonal crosstalk: how glucocorticoids, which are powerful anti-inflammatory drugs, shut down the NF-kappaB pathway.
It's a masterclass in complexity. NF-kappaB is the master regulator of inflammatory genes. Normally, it's sequestered in the cytoplasm by IKappaB. Inflammatory signals degrade IKappaB, freeing NF-kappaB to go activate those genes.
But how do glucocorticoids stop it?
In 3 brilliant ways. 1, they increase the IKappaB protein, sequestering even more NF-kappaB. 2, the glucocorticoid receptor physically competes with NF-kappaB for shared coactivators like CBP300.
So they fight over the same resources.
They do. And 3, the receptor can even directly bind to the NF-kappaB P65 subunit and inhibit its activation. It doesn't just block inflammation, it completely smothers it from multiple angles. So, to summarize this entire system, hormones initiate signals either by slipping into the nucleus, that's group I, acting as these slow, durable gene switches, or by knocking on the plasma membrane, that's group 2. They generate amplified second messengers like CAMPIA, calcium, or they initiate these rapid, complex kinase cascades. And the final, highly specific physiological output is determined by the dynamic interaction between nuclear receptors, their specific DNA response elements, and a whole complex assembly of enzymatic and bridging coregulators that ultimately remodel chromatin and activate transcription.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you to mull over. Our sources highlight that many of these diverse signaling pathways, from insulin, a growth signal, all the way to CAMP-dependent signals, which are often for stress or metabolism, they all converge on key shared regulatory proteins like CBP300. So what does this massive amount of signaling crosstalk tell us about how a single cell, which is being bombarded by dozens of simultaneous hormonal signals, manages to integrate all that information to maintain a stable, coordinated physiological state without just collapsing into chaos? Thank you for diving deep with us.